Within the paradigm of apocalyptic scenarios, one has always held a very interesting place both in real-world preparedness, military doctrine, and of course, the setting for many works of fiction, the EMP.
Houston, this is ISS.
Robert, the circuit breaker.
It wasn't a breaker. It was an EMP. It's an electromagnetic pulse. Fries anything with a circuit board. That means all electronics, appliances, anything with wires.
Baby?
Hey, Brassfax here. As you might have gathered today, we're talking about EMPs, electromagnetic pulses. For those that are not aware and couldn't figure it out with the literal on-the-nose exposition you just watched, a sufficiently strong solar flare or a high-altitude nuclear weapons detonation will produce a pulse that overwhelms or destroys all electronics within the pulse radius. While the effects of EMPs have been observed in countless nuclear tests, most nuclear testing has ceased well before the advent of modern integrated circuits. As such, all depictions of EMP in this matter have been left to works of fiction. In the now generational defining game, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, a Captain Price detonates a SLBM over Washington, D.C. for, questionable reasons, resulting in an EMP destroying all electronics in the area, as well as some innocent bystanders like the etching on the ACOGs. Similarly, in the often quoted book 1 Second After, based off of a congressional report about America's vulnerabilities to EMPs, has a nuclear device detonated over Conus, resulting in the country being effectively sent back to the Stone Ages. All electronic devices are now disabled and destroyed. Much of the book covers how humans and our systems have come not to just rely, but are entirely predicated off of electricities and the systems derived from it. So much so that if a single nuclear weapon was detonated over the United States, it would effectively cease functioning as a nation, and most of the population would basically die off immediately. This book has such a strong depiction of EMPs that it's been quoted to Congress and then also from Congress numerous times as the "we gotta get our act together or else we'll all die." You can look around at other works of fiction and the same story generally repeats, likely due to a nuclear weapon from generally terroristic nations, and everything in the radius gets sent to the Stone Ages. This is great and all, but I have a big issue with all of this, and that it's completely wrong. While there is a certain finality and elegance to a weapon that erases all technology but leaves everything else intact, this is kind of a gross, massive over-exaggeration of the effect of an EMP. Now, we will get to this later, but to be sure, this video isn't an essay on how EMPs are just straight up fake news. EMPs obviously do exist, and they have the potential to cause countless loss of life, the collapse of infrastructure, and generally really just ruin your day. Many systems are extremely vulnerable to the effects of the EMP, but this, as we'll see, is a far cry from the death field that deletes electronics outright that is often depicted in works of fiction. So today we're going to be going over a basic scientific explanation of how EMPs works, how powerful EMPs actually are, and most importantly, what the threshold of damage is for standard consumer-grade electronics in an EMP field. While I do have a background in material science engineering, which spends a lot of time talking about the electronical properties of solids, so a lot of these terms are not unfamiliar to me, at the end of the day, you should take everything I say with a grain of salt. I am heavily summarizing a lot of sources, and I may have made mistakes or may have misunderstood things. If you want more information, be sure to check the description down below and don't take me at my word. But ultimately, as you'll see, I make a very great effort here to stick to what these articles, white papers, research papers actually tell me and leave most of my conjecture out of the picture. Okay, so how does a EMP exactly do its thing? When an EMP is created, typically by a nuclear weapon, not one but 3 waves are produced. We have a E1 wave, a high frequency wave, a E2 wave, a medium frequency wave, and wouldn't you know it, the E3 wave, a low frequency wave. They all arrive at slightly different times, and the first 2 are very much more intense than the third wave, but they only last a fraction upon a fraction of a second, actually even less than that. While the E3 wave, while significantly less intense, lingers for upwards of 1 to 2 minutes, meaning the overall net energy is highest in the final wave. To keep things digestible and to get to the good stuff, we're just going to hand wave the entire effects of an EMP down to a single aspect, the electric field produced. Pardon the rapid-fire EE course, but an electric field is just a voltage over an area, and is denoted by volt per meter. Voltage, or potential difference, is what drives the movement of electrons or electricity, and is essentially what happens when you flip the switch on any device. You complete a circuit with a voltage source, and electrons flow from the minus to the plus. You can extrapolate this to an insane level with mini switches that can be set to either off or on via moving electrons from a source to a drain instead of a physical switch, allowing for extreme miniaturization and the potential of infinite combinations of different switch positions, aka the modern integrated circuit. As you can imagine, applying a voltage to something that is very sensitive to electron positioning will cause the device to behave abnormally. But the effects aren't just limited to circuit pathing. Most devices operate fairly close to their voltage maximums, and a runaway current flow has a very real potential of exceeding the design parameters of said device. Anything from a basic integrated circuit exploding a capacitor to a high voltage power transformer line literally melting under the temperature and load. As you imagine, anything operated by the flow of electron is going to have a bad day if we crank that Sojo Boy up to 12 and apply a large voltage to it. In the context of an EMP, these failure modes are broken up into two fairly self-explanatory camps. We have soft kills and hard kills. As mentioned, those little transistors rely on both the presence and absence of electrons to determine their switch position. So if we apply a voltage to the device, we're going to have abnormal flow of electrons, and an EMP thus is the functional equivalent of trying to take off a 737 while a cat is walking across the flight deck and pressing random buttons during takeoff. Not my best analogy, but you get the idea. Thus, in most cases, even a low-yield EMP will cause unshielded devices to basically be inoperable for the duration of the applied field. Once the field subsides, the device can typically resume function on its own, and we would consider this a soft kill upset. However, if we apply enough fuckery, for the lack of a better term, to the device, a lot of times systems will need a hard reboot to kind of reset itself back to nominal, and this is called a soft kill lockup. For reasons we'll get to, even though the device isn't destroyed, randomly rebooting devices can still absolutely cause serious harm. Should our EMP have sufficient levels of oomph, physical damage to the semiconductor is very likely. Shorting, overvolting, arcing between components, high local temperatures, burnout, you name it, all typically at junctions where multiple wires and circuits converge. Should the damage at these points be of a sufficient level, it obviously falls. The device will no longer function, even once the field is removed, and as such, we call this a hard kill. The question that immediately comes to mind is, how much is an EMP producing? And more importantly, what is the threshold of regular consumer-grade electronics to handle, this effect? This is very hard to fully ascertain, but I'll do my best to piece together some white papers and research papers to get an approximate answer here. With a nuclear detonation, it is roughly agreed upon that an E1 wave seems to peak at 25,000 VM. An E2 wave will peak at something around 50,000 volts per meter, and an E3 wave will hit about 40,000 or less. But recall, this persists for quite a long time compared to the E1 and E2 waves, which literally make a blink of an eye seem like eons. We'll touch on this in a bit, but it's worth noting these numbers are at the source and do absolutely drop off over distance. What do our little black magic wafer boards do when subjected to this type of punishment? In an oddly specific research paper titled The Susceptibility of Some Electronic Equipment to HPEMs, the researchers tested multiple different waves, with some lasting nanoseconds, picoseconds, and a continuous wave at a given hertz from 1 all the way to 100,000 voltmeters. This approximates our E1, E2, and E3 wave produced by a high-altitude EMP type weapon. Maybe I'm just getting old, but sweet Jesus, this was conveyed in about the most horrific manner possible. It also doesn't help that I'm pretty sure this was meant to be color-coded, but looking through it, in this graph we have BFR, breakdown failure rate, referring to soft kills, essentially. Remember, failures that only prevent function during the EMP, with normal function resuming afterwards. And then we have DFR, destruction failure rate, the equivalent to a hard kill, or failure that results in the destruction of the circuit in question. The R in the DFR and BFR refers to a rate, because the researchers actually hit these devices on repeat until they died. So a full value means the device failed with a single pulse. A fraction meant multiple pulses were required. The two different graphs refer to different circuit transistor complexity levels, with the top one being a CMOS-based architecture and the bottom being TTL-based. With these two, we have basically 99% of all consumer-grade electronics covered by these two. Good God, these simplifications are going to get me crucified in the comment section. But reading these graphs, we find that CMOS chips' soft kill seem to cap out at about 25 to 100,000 kVm, and permanent damage occurs well above 125K and more. And with the TTLs, that number is pushed up significantly. As we can see, these chips are actually surprisingly resilient, able to continue function and only getting soft kill when we get to what even the most extreme projections of what a potential EMP might entail. And this is, for the lack of a better term, open-air circuits raw-dogging the full value of an EMP. In the real world, as we mentioned, the numbers are significantly reduced. An actual EMP must contend with the trade-off that altitude is required for area of effect, but altitude also diminishes the strength of the EMP at the fringes. But on top of all that, basically all modern devices contain significant electromagnetic shielding. Remember, there's not all that much that functionally makes an EMP unique from general electromagnetic radiation. It's basically the same thing, and boy, does the world have a lot of it. Every square inch is packed full of wires carrying current, data, and everything, including your fucking fridge apparently, is vomiting EM to communicate with each other tell the weather report. So much so that the amount of EMI radiation that a device can produce is actually heavily regulated. Now, technically, this isn't the exact same type of electromagnetic radiation that a EMP would produce, but by and large, we can kind of wash it all together and consider it roughly the same, as the mitigation effects for electromagnetic interference from radio waves and such more or less get counteracted by the same things that would reduce the effect of an EMP. They're all the same thing, right? Electromagnetic radiation. I think nothing really illustrates the resilience of our technology-based infrastructure as the recent coronal mass ejection event in 2024. You know, that thing that bombarded your social media feed with the exact same long exposure picture of the auroras. Remember, a CME somewhat approximates the E3 component of a nuclear EMP, and while some damage was caused, it was pretty much a nothing burger. The Carrington event, which is often touted as an example of a mankind-ruining situation, while there is only so much information we can infer from an event that happened in 1859, it is generally assumed to be that slightly stronger than the 2024 CME and would have a similar effect to the Halloween 2004 CMEs. So basically, once again, not that big of a deal. It's not to say that any of these components I've talked about are EMP proof, but the data does show that exposed circuits receiving well beyond the full value of a suspected EMP do surprisingly well. And then you add in real-world circumstances of natural shielding and actual intentional shielding, and that effect is further reduced. We can't really say for sure what will happen, at least not yet, but there's a lot of disagreement on the exact strength of an EMP, especially when multiple detonations are used, but it does paint a picture that, as depicted in, say, Call of Duty, Jericho, 1 Second After, the myriads of work of fiction, and the non-stop videos plaguing my YouTube feed, that the notion that EMPs are going to wipe out all electronics is mostly just false. In reality, a large percentage of electronics, and not just the simple one, but advanced complicated systems, are most likely going to survive intact. So, EMPs, one giant nothing burger? It's not quite. While the goal of this video was to dispel the myth of the universal effect of EMP, it's important to note, EMPs are not mostly harmless, quite the opposite. Let's actually look at that congressional report. More or less, the report states that a sufficiently strong EMP, or EMPs, caused by a man-made source have the potential to absolutely cripple a nation. What? I thought you just said that EMP... Yeah, give me a second. While we've established it would not be as fiction depicts, where all devices essentially get hard-killed outright, the reality is much more mundane, but equally as deadly. Soft kills on critical devices throughout our infrastructure very much have the ability to cause untold amount of damage and loss of life, and that is actually entirely the focus of the congressional report. But wait a minute, wasn't the book 1 Second After based on the premise that our entire technological infrastructure would be hard-killed without question, based on this congressional report? Yeah, That is very odd. Yeah, maybe we should stop basing policy on works of fiction. A big one referenced in multiple sources are system controllers and the systems they manage. Basically, we make some really complicated things nowadays that need computers to manage other computers to make sure everything continues operating nominally. Think stuff like RPM controllers, devices that maintain syncs between other equipment, cyclic controllers, pressure regulators, the list goes on. These are highly sophisticated and critical devices. In the event of an EMP, even a short disruption or a soft kill is enough to cause chaos. These are finely tuned, and even a slight disruption can cause catastrophic damage. Even a simple safety shutdown can often require hours or even days to bring the system back to operational levels. An example cited was a basic industrial pressure boiler. When the system gets soft-killed, even for a short time, it's likely that the pressure would increase drastically as the process is temporarily no longer controlled, and the SCADA and its backups would either be offlined or kind of desynced, unable to correct for the spike in thermal output. Best case scenario, the device has to self-shut down. Worst case scenario, complete destruction of the system, despite all of the electronics functionally returning to nominal order very shortly after. I've seen enough live leak videos to know that this happens occasionally even without the assistance of an EMP. And it's not just controllers, it's, well, basically every facet of life. The power grid. High voltage transformers and interconnects are often cited as one of the biggest fears as they operate under very tight margins, and runaway failure or a reboot cycle has the potential to offline large sections of the country, and spare parts and overhead are very limited. I mean, look how badly the Texas power grid got bitch slapped by a light drizzle of snow. Communications similarly would be hit. The article cites a loss of over 95% of telecommunications in the opening days, though it would recover with time. Computer networks, extremely vulnerable in the sense that they are easily shut down, and also during the disruption would send erroneous data. Solid-state drives, similarly, would begin data corruption when subjected to high levels of EM. I could go on and on and on, and in fact, this article goes on for 120 pages that I had to read. Ugh. None of these are smoking guns, at all. And each in isolation, and even a couple together, would very much be manageable. But the big fear cited in these reports is cascading failure in conjunction with other systems, like, I don't know, actual nuclear weapons impact. Cascading failure is failures that breed new failures which feed upon itself to create even worse failures, and then those breed new failures in and of itself, and the list goes on, and then you have a very bad day. That is the real-world fear of EMPs for policy, decision makers, and the military, and it has very little to do with your EOTech cell phone or whatever device no longer functioning. And that's really the goal here today. EMPs, obviously, a real and tangible threat. But within the preparedness community, it's somewhat morphed into an excuse and a cop-out not to learn and utilize and rely on electronic enablers. And in reality, that is just based on a complete non-truths. Or, I don't know, maybe this video is just an elongated, actually video, and none of this actually matters anyway. Yeah, probably that. Anyway, we'll wrap it up there. I think this video may attract some people outside of my core audience, so I'll just say, this is where you get to the best part of the video, footage of my 12-year-old puppy. See ya!
Always do. What you working on, dog? Surgically dismantling this stuff. At least she's not going after a stick that's already on fire.
See more.
And she's not barbecuing her head.
Yeah.
She's not boiling her brains yet. Get that out of here. Get that shit out of here.